The cub was already on the human's chest when the first alarm reached Warden Ivan's skull, and the thing that had carried it there was still standing over the sleeping man with its jaws 4 handspans from his throat. Skull came up out of his rest berth with both hearts hammering out of rhythm, because the tower's alert board was not amber, it was red, and the red was not one light but a column of them. Every motion sensor on the south fence of the Vale Basin Preserve firing in sequence like a fuse, burning towards Station 9. He slapped the master feed open with the flat of his hand. The night array gave him the station porch in gray and silver, the watch cot, the dimmed lantern, the human ranger asleep under a thermal blanket with one arm hanging off the edge, and filling the rest of the frame an ashmaw, not an ashmaw, the ashmaw, 1,100 kilograms of slate-gray fur and shoulder plate, the dorsal ridge standing up along its spine like a row of broken roof slates, the white scar through its left brow that the old survey crews had photographed for 9 years running. Registry designation AX1. The dead rangers of Crew 9 had called him Kodan, and the name had stuck the way names given by the dead always stick. The largest predator on the continent had crossed 2 sensor fences, walked the length of the station boardwalk past 3 sealed doors, and was now lowering its head over a sleeping human being while every automated system in the basin screamed. Skull's species were burrowkin. 40,000 generations of his ancestors had survived by being underground when something like this was above. Every instinct he owned told him to drop below the level of the window and stay there. Instead, he watched, because watching was his entire function, and what he watched made no sense at all. Kodan was not opening his jaws. He was setting something down. The warden enlarged the frame and his breath fogged the screen. A cub. An ashmaw cub. 8 or 9 weeks at most. Fur still in its dark birth coat. Small enough to fit in the carry fold beneath an adult's chin, which was exactly where it had been riding, because Kodan had it gripped by the loose skin of its scruff. Gently, the way the species moved its young between dens. The great head came down over the cot. The cub touched the human's chest, the jaws released. The cub did not wander. It turned once, pressed itself flat against the rise and fall of the man's breathing and went still. Tower, respond. The voice on the handler channel belonged to Drew Vama, the night analyst 3 floors below, and it had gone thin. Warden, are you seeing Station 9? Warden. AX1 is on the porch. AX1 is standing over Hale. I see it. Protocol 4. I'm launching the stun flight. Hold the flight. Skull heard himself say it before he had decided to. On the screen, the enormous animal had not moved, and the man under the blanket had not woken. And there was something in the stillness of the two of them that made the thought of stun drones screaming in over the trees feel like a hand reaching into water that had finally gone calm. Vama, hold. If we light him up while he is standing over the ranger, the first thing that dies tonight is Hale. Static, while 3 floors below a younger and more rule-abiding officer wrestled with that. The drones stayed in their cradles. Kodan lifted his head, and then the apex predator of the Vale Basin looked directly into the porch camera, into the lens, into the feed, into Skull's own eyes 17 kilometers away in a sealed tower, and held the look for a slow count of 5. Skull had read every behavioral file the compact possessed on the species. Ashmaw did not look at cameras. They did not orient on glass or lenses or light. He sat very still in the dark of the tower, a herd-blooded clerk of a being on the safe side of 17 kilometers, and felt looked at the way prey feels looked at. And the feeling said as plainly as anything in his life had ever said anything, "You saw me do this. You are the witness. Act like one." Then the animal turned, took the porch steps in one flowing drop of its body, and walked back across the kill, clearing toward the tree line, unhurried, the alarms of the entire preserve cascading after him like applause he had no use for. The cub stayed. On the cot, the ranger woke. Skull watched him do it and logged the time out of pure habit. 0351 local. Rowan Hale, junior ranger, 26 years old, the last living member of Station 9's crew. He woke the way the file said he always woke since the long dark, instantly, completely. No swimming up through it. And his hand was halfway to the flare rack bolted under the cot before he registered the weight on his chest. He went still. The whole feed went still, man and cub, blanket and birth fur, the lantern hissing. Rowan Hale lifted his head off the canvas, looked down his own body at 4 kilograms of apex predator sleeping over his heart, and then turned his face to the camera with an expression Skull could find no entry for in any species file. It was not fear. It looked almost like recognition. "Tower," the human said quietly. "You watching?" "Voice link open," Skull said. "Ranger, do not move. Retrieval is, don't send anyone." The man hadn't raised his voice. On the thermal layer, Skull watched the cub's heat bloom and the human's heat bloom already bleeding into one shape. "Look at your fence log first. Look what brought her." "I saw what brought her." "Then you know retrieval isn't your call anymore." The ranger laid his head back down, one hand coming up, slow as drifting ash, to rest against the cub's back, not gripping, just there. Tell your drones to go back to sleep, Warden. Nothing on this porch is in danger. That was the moment the Bureau's automated systems, having logged a Class 1 containment breach involving a human staff member, woke up the rest of the civilized galaxy. Skoll spent the hours between then and dawn answering it. He filed while the queries stacked up, and the filing did what filing always did for him. It laid the impossible thing out flat where it could be measured. Item, at 0338, AX-1 had breached the inner fence at a point his telemetry collar showed him visiting 4 times in the preceding week. Reconnaissance, in any honest reading. Item, AX-1's mate, the breeding female designated AX-2, was 8 days dead, crushed in the Den Ridge collapse above the Caro head wall when the worst storm in the basin's recorded history dropped a winter's worth of ice in one night. Item, her single surviving cub had been logged as presumed lost because male Ashmaw did not rear young. The behavioral file was unambiguous on the point. A sire could carry a cub. He could not feed one, could not den one, could not stop his own territorial circuit for one. A cub left with a lone sire, starved in 20 days, and the species seemed to know it. Item last, the one Skoll typed and then sat looking at while the sky outside the tower went from black to gray. 8 months before the storm took AX-2, an earlier arm of the same weather system had taken 6 human rangers on the ice of Larchcall, where they had climbed in the dark to repair the slide warning beacon that watched over both the station and the Den Ridge. Crew 9 had died keeping the warning lights on. The 7th member of the crew had been pinned in the relay shack at the Coal's foot with a broken collarbone and a dead radio, and had spent 2 days digging along the debris line with a folding shovel before the rescue flight reached him. Skoll had written that report too. He had written the report on the Rangers, and he had written, 8 months later, the report on the Den Ridge, and it had not occurred to him until 04:20 this morning that he was the only being on the planet who had filed the deaths of both families. Both families. He caught the word as it went into the record and did not strike it. The Bureau's first reply landed at dawn, and it was exactly what he had told the Ranger it would be. A removal order. Specimen to be crated and transferred to the Varan Rearing Annex, 400 kilometers north, where orphan preserved stock was bottle-raised behind glass by licensed staff. The order carried the seal of the Compact's charter examiner, a being named Vod whom Skoll had met twice and both times come away feeling inventoried. Underneath the seal in the comment field, the examiner had written one line, "The human is to have no further contact with the animal. We do not reward breaches." The crate flight went down to Station 9 at mid-morning. Skoll went with it, riding the jump seat behind the techs and tasting his own stomach, because in 11 years, as warden of the Veal Basin, he had set foot on the actual ground of the actual preserve exactly 9 times, and every one of those 9 times the open sky had pressed on his burrow-bred nerves like a thumb. This was the 10th time, and it went wrong before the skids touched grass. The cub heard the crate before anyone unloaded it, heard it, or felt the change in the human she had spent 6 hours sleeping on, because Hale was standing in the dooryard with his arms folded and his weight set, and anyone of any species could read that posture. The cub flattened herself behind the ranger's boots and screamed. Skoll had never heard the sound a young Ashmaw made in distress. It came out of her tiny body the size of a much larger animal, a saw-edged keening that climbed the cliff face and came back doubled. It was answered. The answer rolled down out of the tree line, where nobody's instruments had thought to look, a frequency more felt than heard, the kind of sound that made every loose pane of glass in Station 9's windows buzz in its frame. The senior crate tech froze with the latch in his hand. On the slope above the station, between 2 firs, stood Koden, and even at 400 meters, even motionless, he changed the arithmetic of the entire morning. "He won't come down," Hale said. He hadn't moved. He was watching the techs the way the techs were watching the mountain. Long as nobody touches her, he won't come down. "You want to test it, Warden? You go ahead and open that crate." The junior tech reached anyway toward the cub, a quick well-meant scoop, the gesture of someone who had handled 100 orphans behind annex glass. The cub's scream turned into a sound with edges. Her lips peeled off needle teeth, her whole pencil-spined little body arched, and 400 meters upslope 1,100 kilograms of sire came off his haunches and took one step down the scree, and the step was louder than the rockfall it started. "Easy." One word from the human pitched low, not to the techs. The cub's snarl stopped. Not faded, stopped, cut clean like a wire pulled out of a speaker. She backed against Hale's shin, pressed there, trembling and silent. Upslope, the sire halted mid-stride, planted, a boulder deciding to be a boulder again. The morning hung by its fingertips. Skoll heard his own voice ordering the crate back onto the flight before he was aware of composing the order. The techs did not argue. The pilot did not argue. Examiner Vod, 400 kilometers away and unaware as yet that his seal had just been overridden by a fence clerk with herd ancestry, did not argue either, though that Skull knew while the flight lifted and Station 9 fell away below was strictly a matter of time. In the dooryard, shrinking to a toy, to a thumbnail, to a grain, the human ranger crouched and let the cub climb his arm to his shoulder, and the great gray sire watched from between the furs until the flight cleared the rim, and not one of the three of them looked away from each other the whole time. The compromise Skull filed that afternoon was a masterpiece of cowardice, and he knew it even as he wrote it. Transfer deferred on welfare grounds, specimen feeding poorly, relocation risk, unacceptable pending stabilization. Interim status, field observation under tower oversight, AX-1 proximity precluding extraction at this time. Every word true. Every word arranged to mean the cub stays with the human because the alternative is to explain to the compact why we shot the last breeding male in the basin to retrieve his daughter. The feeding clause at least required no arrangement. The Annex's formula protocols arrived by the same channel that took his report, and that evening, Skull watched on the dooryard feed as hail-warm broth on the station stove, marrow elk stock from the ration store, cut with the supplement powder the protocol specified, and offered it in the Annex issue bottle exactly per the document, and the cub turned her face away and would not take it. He tried the shallow pan. She walked through it. He tried the bottle again at midnight. Nothing. At the next attempt, the man abandoned the document. He sat down on the porch boards with his back against the wall, poured broth into his own cup palm, and held the hand low against his chest, where his heartbeat was. She drank. Eyes shut, paws braced on his wrist, throat working. She drank everything he could pour one palm at a time, and on the thermal layer her temperature came up by almost a degree, and in the tower 17 kilometers away, Warden Ivan Skull caught himself making a sound his own species used for nestlings, and stopped, embarrassed before his empty office. He pulled the day's biometric trace before he went off shift. 2 heart traces shared the same graph now. The station system had simply assigned the cub to Hale's channel as though she were equipment he had signed for. Asleep, her pulse ran fast and ragged, an orphan's pulse. Then, each night, somewhere in the first hour on the man's chest it slowed, found something underneath it, and settled into step. 2 heartbeats, one large and one small, walking in time like beings keeping each other company on a long road. Skull filed the trace under welfare evidence. Then he sat for a while in the dark of the tower with his 2 reports side by side on the desk. The one from 8 months ago and the one from 8 days ago, 6 names on the first and 1 designation on the second, and the same storm system at the head of both pages. The basin had 2 survivors of the long dark, and tonight they were lying on the same porch, listening to the same furs move, holding between them the only thing either of them had left. In the morning, the Bureau would begin the long process of taking it away. The examiner's second memo was already in the queue. Skull could see the header glowing. He did not open it. He poured the last of his shift tea, turned the night feed back up, and kept the watch, because watching was his entire function, and for the first time in 11 years it felt like one. The thaw came early to the Vale Basin that year, and it came loud, the river throwing off its lids of ice, the headwall shedding meltwater in gray ropes, the marrow elk herds drifting up out of the low country in lines you could see from orbit. Spring was the season the preserve earned its charter, the season the survey flights came back with their holds full of the data and their crews full of wonder. It was also, as every warden in the compact knew and none of them said in front of visitors, the season the poachers came back, because spring was when the basin's animals were thin, hungry, predictable, and worth money. Skull found the first sign of them on the 11th day after the cub's arrival, and he found it because the cub sire showed him where to look. AX-1's collar trace had developed a new habit. The big male still walked his territorial circuit, Den Ridge, Headwall, the salt flats at Bitterling Creek, the long southern fence. But the circuit had acquired a fixed point it never strayed far from, the way a wheel acquires an axle. The axle was Station 9. He bedded within sight of it. He fished the weir pools below it. Twice a night, the perimeter array logged him crossing the kill clearing at a flat walk, head low, doing a slow circuit of the buildings before returning to the trees, and the array had stopped flagging him as a breach, because Skull, in another small cowardice he chose not to examine, had reclassified his transponder from threat to resident. So when the big male broke his pattern, when he abandoned the axle entirely one gray morning and ran the southern fence line at a speed his collar had not recorded since the year of his mating flights, Skull noticed inside a quarter hour. He put a drone over the south fence and flew the line. Kilometer after kilometer of wire and post and wet black timber, and then the drone's lens found what the animal's nose had found first, a clean, surgical gap. The fence's sensor cable had not been cut, which would have tripped the board in the tower. It had been bridged, A shunt looped around a 40-meter section, professional work, the kind of work that cost more than the wire it defeated. And below the gap, pressed into the thaw-soft ground, were the landing feet of a skimmer and the boot prints of at least 4 bipeds, and a confidence about all of it that made Skoll's hide crawl. They had not even hidden the prints. They were not worried about being seen on the ground after the fact. They were worried only about the moment of entry, which meant they were already gone, this time, and meant to come back. He reported it. He shielded nothing and inflated nothing. Probable commercial incursion, professional grade, entry and withdrawal accomplished, purpose unknown. The Bureau's reply allotted him 1 additional patrol drone and a paragraph about budget cycles, and copied Examiner Vod, who added a line of his own at the bottom like a knife laid quietly on a table, noted. The warden's attention is drawn to the unresolved status of the specimen at Station 9. Distraction is a poor lookout. Hale read the incursion report the evening it cleared. Field staff had access rights. And the field staff in question had spent 8 months reading every line the tower produced, because the tower was the only voice that still spoke to him from inside his old life, and called up on the maintenance channel. "Bitterling," the ranger said, with no preamble, "that's where I'd go next if I were them. You bridge the south wire, you're not after elk. Elk you can poach in the low country without ever touching a compact fence. You come inside for what you can't get outside." He paused. On the feed, Skoll could see him on the porch in the last light, the cub asleep across his knees, grown visibly already, her birth coat going at the shoulders to show the slate gray beneath. "You come inside for an apex, pelts, plates, teeth. There's exactly 1 ashmaw using the salt flats this month, Warden, and he goes there because the flat of his hand moved once gently on the sleeping cub, because the flats are on the way to us. They'll have his circuit mapped inside 2 weeks. They're probably mapping it now. The Bureau gave me 1 drone, then put it on the flats at night and keep your collar board open." The ranger looked into the camera, and there it was again. The thing Skoll still had no entry for, the level gray calm of a young man whom the worst thing had already happened to. "And Warden, if it comes to a choice between the rules and him, decide now, while it's cheap. Up here, the moment it actually comes, you get about 4 seconds. Skoll thought about Larch's call, and about what 4 seconds meant to a man who had survived his whole crew, and held his tongue, and put the drone on the flats. For 9 nights, nothing. The basin went about its spring. At Station 9, the cub ate her way through the ration store's marrow elk stock and started on solids. The feeds showed her trailing Hale on his maintenance rounds like a dark thought, pouncing his bootlesses, falling into the weir pool twice, learning the porch steps and then learning them again going down. The sire's circuit turned around its axle. The cub put on 2 kilograms. On the 10th night, Bitterling Creek lit up. It was 0210 when the flats drone caught the skimmer ghosting up the creek line with its running lights, dark and its engine note shaved down to a mosquito's, 4 figures, long cases. They set up on the bluff over the salt with the practiced economy of a crew that had done this on 20 worlds, and Skoll, watching the night array with both hearts climbing his throat, understood their plan in 1 cold drop. They had not mapped the sire's circuit at all. They had mapped the cubs. She had begun coming to the flats in the evenings, this last week. Hale brought her on the rounds. And the rounds ended at the salt, and the data did not lie. A young ashmaw, collarless, unregistered, legally non-existent. A live cub, dart-soft and crate-sized. Worth more than pelts, worth more than plates. Worth a buyer's whole season, somewhere out in the wide, dirty dark beyond the compact's reach. And tonight, for the 10th evening running, the rounds were due at the flats at moonset, and the rounds were 2 minutes out, and the warden had 4 seconds to decide, just as the ranger had promised, and the rules said, do not intervene with staff on the ground. Route all enforcement through the Bureau. Await authorization. Skoll keyed the all-band siren on the flats relay and lit Bitterling Creek up like a festival. Floodlights, fence strobes, the drone dropping to 50 meters with its hailer wide open in 3 trade languages. The bluff exploded into motion, figures snatching cases, the skimmer's engine snarling up from mosquito to hornet, and below, at the tree line, the rounds arrived. The feed gave it to Skoll in silver and gray. The young ranger stepping out of the firs with a cub at his knee, taking in the bluff, the lights, the lifting skimmer, all of it in 1 turn of his head. Then the cub answered the siren. Skoll would think about it for the rest of his life, the size of that sound out of an animal 3 months old, not her crate day scream. Something new, something with the first iron in it, a long rising call that the cliff face caught and threw across the whole South Basin. The skimmer was 40 meters up when the sire came out of the dark. Skoll had his collar trace on the board, and the trace was a flat sprint. 60 kilometers an hour of apex predator arriving out of the night like a falling wall. And Kodan did not slow at the bluff edge. He rose. 1,100 kilograms left the ground, and the drone's lens caught the whole arc of it, the reach, the unsheathed sweep of one forepaw the width of a door, and the skimmer's rear skid came apart in a spray of alloy. The aircraft did not crash. It lurched, shed altitude, caught itself on its fans, and fled wobbling over the south fence at treetop height, one skid gone, a long case tumbling away into the dark below, and after it across the salt rolled a sound that was not a roar so much as a verdict, a sound that stripped the night down to two facts. This is mine, and you live because I chose to hit the machine. Silence then, the special ringing silence after great noise. The floodlights hummed, the salt glittered. The ranger stood at the tree line with his hand resting on the cub's skull, neither of them having moved a step, and the sire turned from the bluff edge and walked to them. And for the first time in the 11 years of Skoll's wardenship, for the first time in the preserve's records, AX-1 came all the way in. He crossed the open salt to the human. He lowered the great scarred head until his nose touched the cub between the ears, and then briefly, with a tenderness that made the watching warden's breath stop, until it touched the man's chest, square over the heartbeat his daughter slept against every night. Then he was gone, up the creek line, a gray thought going back into the dark, and Rowan Hale looked up at the drone, at Skoll, through the floodlit fall of midges, and said, perfectly level, good lights, Warden. 4 seconds. You spent them right. The case the skimmer dropped held a gas-driven dart rifle, a folding crate rated for 200 kilograms of sedated animal, and a sales tablet whose encryption the Bureau's forensics broke in a day. The buyer chain was off-world and went dark at the third link, but the crew's contract of record carried a name the enforcement files knew, Sarah Keth, procurement agent, specialty, live apex stock and trophy materials. 11 prior incursions on 6 worlds, 0 convictions, a professional's professional. The contract's bounty line, when the decrypt finished, made even the Bureau sit up. It did not list a price for the cub, it listed a deposit. Keth had already been paid half in advance by someone who did not accept failure as a deliverable. Skoll read the analysis at his desk at dawn while the spring rain came across the tower glass, in slow gray curtains, and he understood, with the calm that comes when a thing finally takes its true shape, that the night at Bitterling had not ended anything. It had advertised. Somewhere beyond the fence, a patient professional now possessed 3 pieces of knowledge worth more than the deposit. That the basin held an unregistered cub, that the cub came with a sire who killed machines instead of crews, which meant a pattern, which meant a vulnerability, and that both of them, Keth would have watched the drone footage by now, would have run it frame by frame the way Skoll had. Both of them oriented, always everywhere, on a single point of calm at the tree line. On a young human with level gray eyes who stood his ground like a fence post while the night came apart around him. The warden of the Veal Basin closed the file. Below his tower the river ran loud with melt, the firs steamed, the whole green machine of spring turned over. At Station 9, a small slate shape staged an ambush on a maintenance broom and lost. 17 kilometers of preserve lay between the watcher and the watched, quiet, glittering, and Skoll looked out at all of it and felt the season for what it was now. Not a beginning. A countdown running under birdsong. Summer announced itself with a column of smoke. It stood up out of the country south of the preserve on the 4th day of the dry season, white at first, then bruise-colored, then simply a wall. The south reached scrub catching from a dry lightning cell and burning with a year's growth in its teeth and a wind behind it that did not change for 9 days. The fire never crossed the compact fence. It did not need to. The marrow elk wintered in the south country and came north with the green. That was the basin's clock, the engine under everything with claws. When the survey flights finally got through the smoke, the imagery told the whole year's story in one frame. The migration corridors burned to mineral soil, the herd scattered west into the canyon country, and the green wave that should have carried 60,000 animals into the vile basin carrying that summer fewer than 4,000. Skoll ran the prey mass numbers 3 times because the first 2 times he refused to believe the column at the bottom. The basin's predators, the ashmaw, the rakejaw packs of the middle slopes, the fish cats of the river braid, the whole stacked pyramid the preserve existed to protect, were about to spend a season living on 1/10 of their accustomed world. He sent the figures to the Bureau under a famine flag and asked for emergency provisioning authority. Carcass drops, the standard intervention on a managed world. The reply arrived in 11 minutes, faster than any reply in his career, and it was 1 sentence long. And the sentence was the compact's oldest sentence. The charter forbids subsidy of wild populations. A preserve that is fed is a zoo. Below the seal, in comment Examiner Vaught had added, famine is also data, Warden. Collect it. The basin began to starve with great dignity. That was the part Skoll had not been prepared for, the silence of it. No drama on the feeds, no carrion opera. Just a world quietly running out, weir pools, fish to glass, bark stripped to the cambium in neat spirals, the rakejaw packs, splitting and splitting again as their arithmetic failed, the river territories compressing until animals that had never seen one another in their lives stood 20 meters apart at the same dying pool and were too tired to argue about it. AX1's collar told the story in numbers. The big male's circuit, which had turned all spring around its axle at Station 9, stretched and stretched. 40 kilometers a night, then 60, then 90, the great body spending itself across a basin that had nothing to pay it back with. His transponder's mass estimate, recalibrated at each fence gate he passed, walked downhill through the summer with a horrible bookkeeping patience. 1,100 kilograms. 980. The cub, by the same gates, weighed 31 kilograms and was the only predator in the Vale Basin gaining. She gained because Rowan Hale fed her, and Rowan Hale fed her because the law that starved the basin had one seam in it, and the ranger had found the seam in the first week of the smoke. The charter forbade feeding wild populations. The cub was not, on any document the compact possessed, a wild population. She was an unresolved welfare case under Tower oversight, pending transfer, ration entitled. Skoll signed the entitlement without letting himself read it twice. By midsummer, half the station's freight allotment was marrow elk stock and bone, meal, and the cub ate like a furnace, and grew like a lie, and slept each night a little heavier on the chest of the man whose heartbeat had become the floor of her world. The seam in the law did not cover the sire. Skoll watched the big male's mass estimate walk downhill and found out things about himself he had been 11 years not finding out. The night the estimate touched 900 even, the warden of the Vale Basin sat for a long time over a requisition form with his stylus not moving, and then filed, under the maintenance budget, a carcass salvage and disposal order. The basin's fences killed a few elk every year. Disposal was routine. The form had a field for disposal site. Skoll had never once specified a disposal site in 11 years. He began specifying them. A fence-killed elk from the west gate was salvaged and disposed of at the weir pools below Station 9. A skimmer-struck yearling from the north road was disposed of on the Den Ridge Trail. Road kills, fence kills, the freight handler's cold store write-offs, a thin, irregular, scrupulously documented trickle of protein, every kilogram of it logged, every log entry true, and the sum of the truth a quiet lie aimed 20 meters wide of the charter. Vama figured it out in a month, because Vama ran the disposal ledger. The young analyst stood in the door of Skoll's office holding the printout, and the silence had a fork in it, and Skoll looked up and let it fork. What Vama said in the end was, the west gate's killing more elk than it used to. Famine drives them into the wire, Skoll said. Yes, Vama said. I'll note it. And noted it. And from then on, the disposal orders came up from the analyst's desk already drafted, sites filled in, and neither of them ever said the animal's name. But the cub's education moved to the weir pools in the famine's 6th week, because Hale had run the ration projections the same way Skoll ran the prey mass curves, and the two arithmetics agreed. The freight allotment would not carry a growing apex through to the autumn flights. So the feeds began to show a new lesson, conducted each gray dawn at the stone weir below the station. The man crouched on the spillway with his sleeves rolled, hand-dipping for riverback char the slow way, the old way, the way his crew chief had taught him his first year. And beside him, soaked to the shoulder hump, vibrating with concentration, 50 kilograms of student learning the only kind of patience her bloodline respected, the kind with a payoff in its teeth. She missed for 9 mornings. The morning she connected, a half-kilogram char snapped out of the spill in a sheet of silver water. She did not eat it. She carried it up the bank, laid it on the stones at the man's boots, and sat, tail thrashing, while he made over her like she had brought down a bull elk. And Vama's morning drone caught the whole transaction, and the tower archived it under training outcomes because no one had the courage to file it where it belonged. The famine watched the lessons too. In the 7th week, a fish cat came to the weir at dawn with 3 kits at heel, a river braid. Female starved down to wire and shadow, pushed off her drained territory, desperate enough to contest a spillway that smelled of ash maw and man. She came in flat and silent along the far bank, and the cub rose with her rough up and her new deep warning already rolling, and what stopped the morning from becoming the famine's arithmetic was the human voice, low even. 2 words, letter. The cub's warning cut off mid-roll. She stood down, visibly against every instinct firing in her, and the weir traffic was rewritten on the spot. The near spill to the ash maw and the man, the far spill to the fish cat and her kits. An offense of pure watched courtesy down the middle. The female fished an hour and took 4 char and left the way she came. She came back the next dawn and the one after. By the famine's 9th week, the far spill had its own regulars. The fish cat line, a limping rakejaw outcast too broken for the Confederation, 2 scavenger drifts, A whole small parliament of the starving fishing an armistice 20 meters from an apex cub, because the weir had a law now, and the law had a voice. And every desperate animal in the South Basin had learned what the law's two words sounded. Like. Skoll flagged the pattern in his private file, with hands that were not entirely steady. The basin is reorganizing itself around the porch, he wrote. The charter calls this distortion of wild behavior. I have begun to wonder what the charter would call a famine survived. What the trickle could not do was hold back the mountain's own bookkeeping. A 900-kilogram apex cannot live on salvage, and the basin's other hungers found the drops as often as he did. In high summer, the rake jaws came down off the middle slopes, not a pack anymore, but a confederation of broken packs, 30 animals running together because 30 could take what 10 could not. And the feeds began to show them, ghosting along the station fence at dusk, heads low, ribs like barrel staves, eyes catching the floodlights in rows. Hale called it before the tower's predictive model did. They're not after the drops anymore, he said on the evening link, while behind him on the porch, the cub 40 kilograms now, the birth coat gone entirely. A slate-gray adolescent shadow of her sire, lay chin on paws, ears moving like instruments. They've watched the freight flights land all summer. They know where the meat comes from, Warden. It comes from inside the cold store. One of these nights they're going to stop waiting for me to carry it out. Skoll put it in his risk log and asked the Bureau, on the famine flag, for a second staff post or at minimum a stun fence upgrade for Station 9. He attached the prey mass curves, the pack fusion imagery, the fence pressure incidents, 11 years of a spotless record, and his own formal assessment that a single ranger at an isolated post was now at material risk. The Bureau declined the post on budget cycle grounds. Examiner Vod's comment line read, the risk described is an argument for withdrawing the ranger, not for reinforcing him. The examiner's office renews its recommendation that Station 9 be unmanned and the specimen transferred. The warden may consider this the final renewal before the recommendation becomes an order. Skoll read the line 4 times. Then he forwarded the whole file to Station 9 because he had promised himself in the spring that the man on the ground would never learn anything important from anyone later than he learned it from the tower. Hale's reply came back in text, 2 lines, time-stamped 0140, which meant he had read it on watch with the cub asleep against the small of his back. If they unman this station, the drops stop and the wire war starts, and every animal in this basin loses. I'm not leaving. Tell me when I'm fired. The rake jaws came for the cold store 19 nights later, on the first hard-wind night of autumn's edge, and they came the way starving professionals come. All at once, from 3 directions at 03, with the wind covering their sound and the floodlit yard empty as a stage. Skoll was on shift. He would be grateful for the rest of his life for the smallness of that mercy. That it happened on his watch and not between checks, that he saw it begin. The yard array caught the first mover coming over the fence where the famine-pressed dirt had been dug into a ramp by a summer of patient feet. A big dog rake jaw, gaunt and quick, then 2 more behind it, then the camera count stopped mattering because the south fence line was moving the way. The ground moves when it is not ground but animals. The tower's siren reached Station 9 in half a second. The tower's drones were 11 minutes out. The feeds gave Skoll the next 4 minutes whole, and he watched them standing up, both hands flat on the console, doing the only thing his post and his species and the 11 kilometers of dark allowed him to do, which was witness. The porch light came on. The ranger came out of the station door into the wind with a flare gun in one hand and the meat axe from the cold store in the other, and he did not shout and he did not run. He walked to the top of the steps and put a flare into the yard, low, skidding, a comet of magnesium that turned 30 starving animals into a frozen woodcut of themselves. And into the afterhiss of it, he said, in the same voice the feeds had recorded at the crate, at the salt flats, at the bottle, at every hinge of the year, low, flat, certain, no. And the front of the pack, animals that had not been within a flare's light of a human voice all the desperate summer, broke stride, stopped, stood swaying in the magnesium glare with their heads down and their decision suddenly nowhere in them, because the voice had landed on some old wire in their spines that the famine had not gotten to yet. The rest of the pack kept coming. 30 does not listen like 3. What the yard camera caught next, Skoll would extract, enhance, timestamp, and ultimately enter into compact record, where it would be watched by more beings than any other 40 seconds of footage in the preserve's history. The station door stood open behind the ranger. Out of it, past his hip, moving not away from the threat but through the human shadow, and ahead of him came the cub. 5 months old, 43 kilograms against a confederation. She put herself on the steps below the man, between him and the yard, in the place where her bloodline had stood between its own and the world for 10,000 generations, And what came out of her was not her crate day scream, and not her flats night call, but the third sound, the adult sound, the verdict sound, 50 kilograms of body producing a thing the cliff face threw back like falling rock. And the night answered her twice. Once from the tree line, where 1,100 pounds of famine-thin sire arrived out of the dark already at speed, having been, the collar trace would show, already 2 kilometers into a dead run when the flare went up, because he had heard the wind change around his daughter's silence. And once from the yard itself, where the Rakejaw Confederation, caught between a flare, a voice, a cub speaking her bloodline's oldest word, and the incoming sound of the basin's one remaining king, performed the only sane act available to starving mathematics. It subtracted itself. The fence line moved again, reversed, poured back over the dug ramp the way water pours when a gate fails. And by the time Coden hit the yard light at a flat run, there was nothing left in it to hit but scent. He pulled up in the magnesium afterglow, sides heaving like a bellows, hide loose on the great frame the summer had been spending, and swung his scarred head along the empty fence, and then turned, as everything in the basin turned toward the steps. The cub stood her ground one heartbeat longer, facing the dark she had just emptied. Then she sat down abruptly on the bottom step, the way the young of every species sit when the courage runs out of breath after the need for it, and leaned hard into the leg of her human. Hale lowered the flare gun. The feed's audio, wind-scoured, caught his one sentence, and the sentence was to the sire. "Both of us," he said. "We've got her. Go eat." The big male stood a moment, ribs working. Then he walked through the yard to the foot of the steps, into arm's reach of a standing human for the second time in recorded history, and dropped his nose briefly to his daughter's head and to the man's hand at his side. What the Night Array's directional mic recorded then was disputed by half the Bureau's acoustics section and immortalized by the other half. A low engine room rumble out of the deep of the famine-hollowed chest, 2 seconds, warm, unmistakable to anyone who had ever been near a content animal of any world. And Vama, 3 floors below Skoll, said over the internal channel in a wrecked whisper, "Warden, tell me we're keeping that." "We're keeping all of it," Skoll said. He flagged the footage to the welfare file. Then he sat down, alone in the lit tower in the dark basin, and let go of a breath he had been holding since '03, or possibly since spring. On the porch, the man sat down on the top step, and the cub climbed up beside him and put her head, too big now for laps. She no longer fit anywhere she still believed she fit. Across his knees, and they stood there while the flare died, 2 gray shapes against the lit doorway, and below them in the yard the king of the basin tore into the night's disposal drop, eating at last, with his family between him and every direction. 17 kilometers away, the being whose function was watching wrote one line in a log he had begun keeping that summer outside every requirement of his post, a private file with no routing field, the only document in 11 years he had ever addressed to no one. "They lost everything in the same storm," he wrote. "Watch what they are building out of it." The last freight flight before the autumn winds brought the basin's first visitor in a year, and the visitor was a problem, because the visitor was an Ashmaw. The fence array logged him at dawn on the first cold morning, a male full-grown, walking up the burned country from the south with the smoke stink still in his hide, and he came up the migration corridors where nothing living had come all summer like the fire's own delegate. Big, the gate estimate said 960, which on a frame meant for 1,200 meant young and starved rather than small, and marked the whole left flank a hairless sheet of burn scar, one ear gone to it. The registry had nothing on him, he was no one's data. He had walked out of a dead country because animals do not lie down in arithmetic, they walk, and at the south fence of the Vale Basin, he had hit the scent line of the resident male, and stopped and stood for 1 full hour reading it. Then he crossed it, and Skoll, watching, heard himself say aloud in the empty tower, "No, not this year, not now," because the basin could not carry 2 of them. That was not drama, it was the prey mass column. And no species that survives carries 2 kings in 1 famine. The scent line was a written law, and crossing it was a signed challenge, and somewhere out along the 90-kilometer ruin of his circuit, the moment the wind turned, the resident would read the signature and come home to answer it. Thin, spent, half-fed on fence kills, a wall that had been 3 seasons crumbling. The burned stranger did what challengers do. He did not go to the heart of the territory. He went to its edges and began unwriting them, overmarking the boundary posts of scent one by one, eating what he could find, putting his presence into the wind hour after hour like a name being said louder and louder. The tower's drones kept him in frame. Hale, when Skoll briefed him, was silent for a long moment, and then said the thing Skoll had been circling for a day and refusing to land on. "He's not evil, Warden, he's us 8 months ago. Everything he had is ash, and he walked out of it carrying nothing, and the only door he found was ours." The ranger looked off camera, south, though the station's windows faced the yard. and he's still going to kill Kodan. Both things are true. That's the whole problem with this year. The wind turned on the third night. The collar trace turned with it. AX-1 came home across the basin in a line that ignored the circuit entirely, 90 kilometers in 11 hours, and the trace did not read like rage. It read like duty, a steady commuter's pace from the far fence straight toward the salt flats at Bitterling Creek, the open ground where his kind had always done this, because among Ashmaw the challenge was answered where there was room for the loser to leave. And Skull, plotting the intercept, found the night's second trace already converging on the same flats from the south, hours ahead, patient, and the night's third anomaly sitting in his queue flagged by the perimeter system. The southern fence shunt, the bridged 40 meters from the spring, read live again. Keth had been waiting for this too. Of course he had. A procurement agent with a paid deposit, a drone footage library of the basin, and a professional's patience had spent the famine the way Skull had, watching the mass estimates walk downhill, watching the stranger walk north, running the arithmetic of kings. 2 apex males meant a challenge. A challenge meant a loser too damaged to defend himself, and a winner too spent to flee. The salt flats meant open ground, clean shooting, easy loading. The wire was bridged because the crew was already inside. The warden of the Veal Basin looked at the 3 converging lines on his board, the king, the stranger, the buyers of both, and at the weather feed, which promised for tomorrow night the season's first hard frost, still air, a hunter's moon, and at the duty roster which held one name. Then he called Station 9, and when the level gray eyes came up on the screen, Skull heard his own voice arrive somewhere it had been walking toward all year. "Ranger," he said, "I am coming down. Tomorrow we are going to break the charter together in the open, on the record. Bring the cub. The flats will need her voice before it needs ours." The flight down was the 11th time in 11 years that Warden Ivan Skull had stood on the actual ground of his preserve, and the ground met him with frost. It rhymed the boardwalk of Station 9, furred the fence wire, turned the kill, clearing the color of bone. The sky was the worst of it. Burrowkin never stopped feeling the sky, and this sky was high and hard and swept clean for the hunter's moon to come. And Skull stepped down from the skids with his hide bristling and his resolve in both fists, and was met at the bottom of the steps by 50 kilograms of adolescent Ashmaw, who walked a slow circle around him, reading him from boots to breath, and then sat down in front of him and looked up. "She's deciding about you," Hale said from the porch. He was loading flare cartridges into a bandolier with the unhurried economy that the feeds flattened and the ground did not. In person, Skull could see what 11 months of the year had built. Not bulk, not swagger, just a man worn down to only the parts that worked. Everything that lands here gets decided about. The cub finished. Whatever the verdict was, it ended with her pressing her brow briefly against the warden's knee, a down payment of trust that nearly buckled it. And Skull, 11 years a clerk of predators, stood in the frost being chosen by one and understood, in his body finally, why every protocol he enforced from the tower came apart on this porch. There was no procedure for being known. They worked the plan flat on the station table like a field dressing. The flats could not be defended. The flats were 2 square kilometers of open salt. The challenge could not be prevented. It was already written and sent on every boundary post in the South Basin, and stopping the resident from answering it meant fences he would not honor and stun loads his famine-worn hearts might not survive. "So we don't stop the fight," Hale said. "We referee it. The fight's theirs. What happens around it is ours." His finger moved on the survey map. "Keth shoots from the bluff, same as Spring. It's the only cover with line of sight. He'll have the dart rifle for whichever male he wants alive and net gear for her." The finger stopped on Bitterling Bluff and stayed there. "So tonight before moonrise, we own the bluff. The charter," Skull said, "directs me to route interdiction through the Bureau and await enforcement assets." The words came out of him in the Bureau's own dead voice, and he heard what he had never let himself hear from the tower, that the sentence was a coffin built of grammar. "Enforcement is 9 hours away on a good day. I logged the request at dawn. I logged it as a formality, Ranger. I am not waiting for it." The cub, sprawled under the table across both their boots, sighed in her sleep like a furnace banking. "Then say it plain," Hale said, not looking up from the map, and there was something in his voice Skull had not heard in it before, something almost gentle. "You're a long way from the tower, Warden." "I am where the watching led," Skull said. "Say your plan." They went out at dusk, 3 of them. The frost deepened with the dark. The salt threw the early stars back, and they climbed Bitterling Bluff from the blind side with a drone holding silent overwatch and a sledge of equipment that had never been requisitioned for any purpose the manifest would survive. The station's 2 spare flood lamps, every flare in the rack, 200 meters of fence wire, and the freight handler's cargo net, the heavy one, rated for a slung quarter-ton. Keth's crew came up the creek line at moonrise, 5 of them this time, and walked into the only piece of cover on 2 square kilometers of salt, which was the trap, because of course it was. A procurement agent reads ground the way a warden reads telemetry, and a wiser one might have wondered why the bluff felt so available. But the wind was clean, the basin was loud with frost crack, the tower drones were logged on the far fence. Skull had moved the logs himself, the first deliberate false entry of his career, filed under a heading he intended to defend with his career, and professionals trust their own footage. The footage said the basin's enforcement was 1 clerk in a tower and 1 ranger with flares. The footage had not met the third thing on the bluff. The cruise point man crested the rim, swept his lens once across the rocks and found, standing up out of the frost shadow at 4 meters, the silhouette of a half-grown ashmaw with her ears flat and her ruff up and the moon behind her. He did the human thing, the thing every species did. He froze. And into his frozen half-second came the basin's law in a young voice, her yard night. Sound, the verdict sound, delivered at 4 meters into a confined rock bowl that doubled it, and the bluff came apart. 2 of the crew simply ran, gear and all, the oldest instinct on any world executing flawlessly. The point man dropped the dart rifle where he stood. Keth and his second, harder stock, wheeled toward the rim's far exit, and found it occupied by a human ranger holding a lit flare at shoulder height, with 200 meters of fence wire strung knee-high through the rocks at his back and a cargo net staked over the only clean descent. "Veal Basin Preserve," Hale said, in the tone of a man reading weather. "You're inside it. Put the cases down." What saved the night from being simple was the salt. Out on the flats, on schedule, indifferent to every smaller animal's plans, the Kings arrived. Skull, flat on the bluff's north shoulder, with the drone feed in one eye and the open dark in the other, watched them come like 2 weather systems. The resident from the north at his commuter's pace, the burned stranger up from the south already turning broadside, displaying, the scarred flank catching the moon like a salt pan of his own. They stopped at 40 meters, 2 famine-carved silhouettes on white ground. The sounds they exchanged crossed the flats and climbed the bluff and got into the bones of everyone on it. Keth's second put the equipment case down without being asked again. The forms held for 3 breaths. Then the forms broke, and the Kings met, and the meeting was nothing the documentaries prepared anyone for. No roaring, circling theater, just 2 masses arriving at the same coordinates with the noise of a vehicle collision, plate against plate, the shock of it audible as a flat crack a second later on the bluff. The resident gave ground. Everyone watching knew the arithmetic. He was 3 seasons of catastrophe walking, and the stranger was younger, and grief is not muscle. He gave ground and gave more, and the stranger's next surge put him down on one shoulder in the salt with a sound like a felled tree. And that was the moment Sarah Keth, professional, with his crew broken and his exit netted and his bounty collapsing toward a corpse he hadn't contracted for, made the last cold calculation of his contract, that a man holding a flare is a man with no hands for a weapon. He came up out of his crouch with a sidearm, not a dart gun, the other kind, and leveled it not at the ranger but past him, at the cub on the rim, at the deliverable. 3 things happened inside the next second, and Skull, who would be required to reconstruct the second under oath, ordered them this way. The ranger moved, not away, across. He crossed the line of fire with the unhesitating totality of a man whose body had decided 8 months ago, on a different piece of ice, what it was for, and he put himself between the muzzle and the cub with the flare still burning in his fist. The cub moved with him, toward him, under the arc of his arm, against his legs. 2 bodies closing into one target out of one shared instinct with 2 bloodlines' names on it, and the warden of the Veal Basin, Burrowkin, herd-blooded, 11 years a watcher behind 17 kilometers of glass, came up off the north shoulder of the bluff and hit Sarah Keth at the knees. He was not built for it. That was, he would think later, possibly the point. Nothing in Keth's professional footage had a column for the clerk. They went down together among the frost rocks, the sidearm cracking once into the sky, and then the rocks were loud with bodies. Hale's boot pinning the weapon hand flat, the cargo net coming off its stakes and over the agent in a tangle he made worse by fighting, and through all of it, under all of it, the flats kept happening, the collision noise of the Kings rolling up the bluff like surf while 2 humans, 1 alien, and a half-grown cub trust the galaxy's most patient procurement agent in his own equipment. It was the cub who stopped, first, and looked out. Then they all did, because the rhythm of the fight below had broken, not ended, broken, and what had broken it was a third sound, thin and wrong. The hiss-snap of a gas dart rifle, fired from the creek line south of the flats, where Keth's 2 runners had not, after all, kept running. The dart took the burned stranger high in the burned flank, mid-surge standing over the downed resident. He spun at the sting. Took 2 steps. Stood swaying in the moonlight on the open salt with 30,000 credits of sedative arithmetic walking up his bloodstream. Loser, too damaged to flee. The winner, too drugged to fight. Either way, the contract paid, and his legs began to misunderstand him. And on the bluff, Rowan Hale was already moving, vaulting the wire, taking the staked descent in 3 strides, sprinting out onto 2 square kilometers of open salt between 2 apex predators and a hidden rifle, shouting back over his shoulder the only order he gave that night. "Light! Give me light and her voice!" Skull keyed everything. Both flood lamps off the sledge, the drone's hailer, the bluff strobes. Bitterling Flats went white from rim to creek, a salt pan turned operating theater, and into that whiteness, from the rim, the Cub poured her verdict sound with the bowl of the bluff for a horn behind her, and the white and the sound crossed the flats together and arrived where the runners crouched at the creek line as a single fact. You are seen. The second dart never came. The creek line shed 2 fleeing shadows south. Out on the salt, the night assembled its last tableau, and the drone framed it for the record at center stage. Full light, no enhancement required, and this was the 40 seconds that would be screened, in the end, before the full Compact Charter Commission, with not one being in the chamber breathing. The burned stranger down on his side, drugged to the edge of his heartbeats, one eye still moving. The resident king of the Vile Basin, beaten, bleeding from the plate line, 3 seasons of ruin in his hide, on his feet, standing not over a defeated rival in triumph but over a downed fellow apex, square between the stranger's body and the creek line the dart had come from, facing outward, holding the whole southern dark in promissory wrath exactly as a smaller copy of him had stood on station steps over a smaller threatened thing. The challenge dead, the territory question obsolete. 2 kings and 1 law older than the difference between them, not while I stand here. And walking out to join them across the blazing salt, small and steady, a human and a half-grown cub, side by side, at the pace of people coming to help. Hale worked on the stranger's flank until the tower's medical drone reached the flats, kept the airway clear, packed frost against the dart site, did the half-dozen unglamorous things that decide whether sedation is a nap or an ending, and the whole time, 4 meters away, the resident king stood his outward watch and let him. Let the man kneel in the salt at the body of his rival. Let the cub press in and nose at the burned ear at the scar sheet, while the stranger's eye followed her with a slow, drugged wonder. When at last the drone arrived and Skoll, half-trust agent in tow, came down to the salt, the warden walked the final 100 meters as if into deep cold water, past the cub, past the kneeling ranger, into arm's reach of 2 apex males of the deadliest land species on the planet. And the moment the resident's scarred head swung toward him, every prey strand in 40,000 generations of ancestry burst alight and screamed run. Skoll stood still. He had learned it from the best. The great head considered him. The clerk who fed the basin through a maintenance ledger, the watcher who had finally come down and then dismissed him with a slow blink whose meaning no acoustics section would ever need to dispute. Him we keep too. The king turned, gathered himself with a wince that put a hot wire through Skoll's chest, and limped north across the salt toward the firs, toward the axle of his world, leaving his beaten rival breathing in the care of his strange new pack. They named the stranger that night because Hale flatly refused to file a recovery report on a being called null registry mail. The burned country he had walked out of, the old maps called the Cinder Reach. Cinder then, the ranger said, writing it, and the basin had a second name given by the living to set beside all its names given by the dead. Saroketh left the preserve at dawn under enforcement escort, netted, documented, furious in a contained professional way, and the last thing he saw before the flight sealed was the cub, sitting on the landing pad in the first sun with her head cocked, watching him be carried in the kind of crate he had brought for her. Skoll made sure of the sightline personally. He logged it as incidental. The arrest dispatches went up the chain that morning. The commendations, Skoll knew from 11 years of reading the chain's weather, would take a week. The other thing took 4 days. It arrived on the 5th morning under the Charter Commission's highest seal, over Examiner Vod's signature, and it was not a memo, and it had no comment field. Finding: gross procedural violations at Vile Basin Preserve, falsified drone logs, misdirected salvage, unauthorized civilian interdiction, willful obstruction of a standing transfer recommendation. Order: Station 9 to be unmanned and the unregistered specimen seized for transfer to the Varan Annex. Warden's authority suspended pending review. Execution of seizure to be supervised on-site by the examiner's office in person, and a date. The examiner's flight would land in the Vile Basin in the 3rd week of winter, the dark week, the anniversary week, a year to the storm, and the compact, which forbade subsidy of wild populations, was sending a clerk of its own into the high country at the exact turning of the season when the basin remembered, in ice, what it was capable of. Skoll read the order twice, alone in the tower he was now suspended from, with the frost-making continents on the glass. Then he called Station 9 and read it aloud, every word, including the date, and waited. On the screen, the young ranger was quiet a long moment. Behind him, immense on the porch she had outgrown, the cub lay watching the north with her ears up and beyond the wire like a gray landmark. Like the season itself, her father kept the tree line. "Third week of winter," Hale said at last. And what was in his voice was not fear and was not anger. Skoll, who had spent a year learning the man frame by frame, finally had an entry for it. It was the sound of him on the ice of Larchcall with a folding shovel, deciding to dig. They're coming up here, into the long dark, to take a daughter off the last man at Station 9. He looked into the camera. "Then we'd better make sure they survive the visit, Warden. Every one of them. Whatever it costs us, they go home knowing exactly what they tried to create." Winter came down the basin like a lid going onto a pot, and with it came the thing nobody had a protocol for, because the thing was time itself. The cub turned 10 months old in the first snow, and 10 months in an ash maw was a door. She was 140 kilograms now. She came up past Hale's hip, her dorsal ridge was cutting through in slate shingles, and her verdict sound had dropped half an octave into something that emptied the yard of ravens in a wing beat. None of that was the door. The door was in the telemetry, and Skoll, suspended from authority but not anyone conceded from his own tower, where he stayed on as observing officer because the Bureau had sent no replacement into a famine winter, watched it open night by night. She had started ranging. It began as hour-long absences on the station feeds, then half-nights, then whole ones. 140 kilograms of adolescence slipping the fence at moonrise and casting north along her father's old boundary posts, reading them, overmarking them in places with her own new signature. Twice the drones found her at the Den Ridge itself, at the collapsed headwall under which her first life lay buried, standing in the snow with her nose working at the ice for an hour at a time. Every line of the species file said what this was: den seeking. The age at which a female ashmaw walked out of her birth story and went to write her own and did not come back. "She'll go in the spring," Hale said one evening, watching her gray shape flow over the wire and away, and his voice was so carefully level that the feed compression nearly flattened the cost out of it. "Nearly. That's right. That's what she's for. Warden, you raise them to leave." A pause, the lantern hissing. "Doesn't mean the porch won't be quiet." Skoll, who had spent the autumn learning to say true things at the right time instead of filing them, said, "She does not den like a lever." "What's that mean?" "Levers den outward. Far edge of the natal range, as far from the birth den as the territory allows. It is in 11 years of my survey data. She has cast north 40 times since the snow. Every den site she has tested is on the ridgeline above this station." He let it land. "Whatever she is for, Ranger, she appears to be drawing her own conclusions about where its center is." The man looked at the dark where she had gone and said nothing, and the hand at his side closed once on nothing the way a hand closes on a small head that is not there yet. The examiner's flight came in on the first day of the third week of winter, 11 days before the anniversary, under a sky the color of gunmetal that every instrument in the basin agreed was about to become an event. Skoll met it at the Station 9 pad. Vod came down the ramp first, and he was exactly as Skoll remembered, tall for his line, dry, precise, swaddled in expedition thermals that had never met weather, with eyes that inventoried the station, the yard, the warden, and the young ranger on the porch in 4 equal seconds, pricing everything. Behind him came a seizure detail of 4 annex handlers. Big, careful beings with the soft-sided crate and the dart kit and a transfer cage rated, this time for 200 kilograms, because the examiner's office read telemetry too. The cub was not there. Hale had not hidden her. She had simply gone north at moonrise as she now went, and what stood watch instead, half a kilometer up the tree line in plain sight of the pad, drawn up out of the firs like a piece of the mountain that had opted to be specific, was her father. The seizure detail saw him on their first sweep. The crate did not come off the flight that day. "You will produce the animal, Ranger," Vod said. It was evening. The station's main room was crowded with thermals and procedure. Outside the frost-furred window, the gunmetal sky had begun, very quietly, to snow. "Voluntarily by call or lure before the weather closes. My order executes this week." How it executes is the only variable you control. "You've read my file," Hale said. He set mugs of ration tea down the table, the host's gesture exact and unhurried, and Skoll watched the seizure detail glance at one another and reclassify him, the way the basin's every visitor sooner or later reclassified him. "Then you know I don't control her. Nobody controls her. She's not equipment. Examine her, and she's not a specimen. She's a yearling apex 20 kilos heavier than your cage rating who chooses this station every morning, and what you're calling an execution variable is whether your handlers walk into that choice with a dart kit." He sat down across from Vod and met the pricing eyes with his level gray ones. "I'll say the rest plainly, because the storm coming in deserves plain speech. Your flight should lift tonight. 11 days from now is a year to the long dark. The basin's about to do again what it did to my crew and his mate, and every life you brought up this mountain is my watch now, including yours. Take the week, Examiner. Come back at thaw and I'll stand whatever review you write. But get your people off my mountain before tomorrow night. Vod's expression did not change. Skull had seen audit seals with more weather in them. The order executes this week, the Examiner said. We are staying. The storm made landfall 31 hours later, 8 days early, and the basin's instruments sang it up the scale and out the top of their ranges one by one like choristers giving up. By dusk, the wind over the head wall was at numbers Skull associated with airframe stress tables. By full dark, Station 9 stood inside a white roar. The seizure flight was lashed to the pad under storm anchors with liftoff of fiction, and the Examiner's office, the observing warden, the last ranger in the Vile Basin, and a seizure detail with nothing seizable were all sealed in one creaking station listening to the year complete its circle. The Cub came home an hour ahead of the front, soaked, rhymed, enormous, and walked through the crowded main room as if it were empty, and lay down with her spine pressed the length of Rowan Hale's bunk frame, and put her head on his boots. The seizure detail stood very still against the walls. Vod watched inventory eyes moving from the animal to the ranger and back, pricing something that was not in any of his columns. The relay died at 0217. Skull was awake. Every warden instinct he owned was awake, and he saw the board do it, the Larch Coal beacon. The slide warning relay Crew 9 had died repairing, the high lonely instrument that watched the snow load on the head wall above both the station and the buried Den Ridge dropped off the network between one polling cycle and the next. No brownout stagger, no storm flicker. One cycle present, the next gone. He pulled the final packet and read it with his hide rising. The beacon's last data was healthy. Power nominal, antenna nominal, snow load telemetry mid-range and rising, and then nothing, total, instantaneous, the signature of exactly one thing, and that thing was not weather. Severed, he said. Hale was already across the room, reading the packet over his shoulder. Hardline and backup in the same second. Ranger, the storm does not do that. No, Hale said, it doesn't. He straightened, and in the lamplight his face had gone somewhere 8 months away. Cut clean, in the worst hour of the worst night of the year. Same beacon, same week. He turned to the room, to Vod, upright and instantly awake among his handlers, and laid it out the way he laid wire, fast and straight. The call relay is the only thing that sees the head wall load. Snow's been on that slope 11 days. The last packet says it's rising through mid-range. If it sheets, the slide path forks at the call. One fork took my crew's beacon shack last year. The other fans out above this station. Without that relay, we're blind to the one thing on this mountain that can kill everyone in this room while we sleep. Then we are fortunate the station is rated for, Vod began. It was severed, Examiner. Hale's voice did not rise. The room reorganized itself around it anyway. Somebody is on the call, tonight in this, with cutters and a reason. There's one reason. The contract on her. The Cub had lifted her head, her ears were forward, fixed on the north wall as though it were a window, paid half in advance to a professional who has made bail on 11 worlds, and the completion window is any hour. All of compact enforcement is pinned down by weather, and every camera on this mountain is ice blind. They cut the beacon because it's bait and cover both. Whoever climbs to fix it walks to the one place they control, and whoever doesn't fix it spends the night praying the head wall holds. They've read us, Warden. They know this station won't sit blind under that slope. They know who will come. The room was silent except for the building's long groans and the white roar beyond. Then no one goes, said Vod. We accept the risk of the slope. You don't know the slope, Hale said. I do. 11 days load and rising, and this wind stacking cornice on the lee since dusk. I gave my crew to that arithmetic Examiner. I'm not giving them this station, too. He was already moving, bandolier, ice kit, the relay spares case that lived packed by the door because at Station 9, everything that mattered lived packed by the door. The repair takes one set of hands 20 minutes. I'll take the gorge line up, not the shack line. They'll stake the ambush at the shack because that's where the path is. He looked at the Cub, and the Cub was already on her feet, filling a quarter of the room, shaking the sleep off her shoulders like water. For one moment the man's level mask moved, and what was under it was not fear of the mountain. And there's no fence in this basin that holds her when I'm on it. So she comes. Warden, I am coming as well, Skull said. Both hearts were slamming. He said it anyway, because the year had been one long rehearsal for saying it. You will need a second set of eyes on the load readings and a voice the tower systems obey. And I will not. The words found themselves 11 years late. I will not watch this one on a feed. Vod stood. The Examiner pulled his expedition thermal straight with a precise, furious little motion, and what he said was the last thing anyone in the room expected, possibly including himself. My order requires on-site supervision of all dispositions of the specimen, he said. The specimen is about to disposition itself up a mountain. If the alternative is signing a report assembled from your testimony, warden, testimony from a station whose logs you have already once falsified, then I am coming to witness whatever the truth turns out to be. Examiner, Hale said, the truth up there gets people killed. So, said Vod, does paperwork. I have read your file too, Ranger. And he picked up the spare ice kit and could not work the buckle, and stood there holding it with his inventory eyes, daring anyone to assist, until the cub crossed the room and the seizure detail flattened against the walls, and she stopped in front of the Charter Commission's examiner, sniffed once at the kit, once at him, and made low in her chest a sound her file had no entry for either. The engine room rumble, brief and warm. Her father's sound, him we keep too. It appears, Vod said into the silence with the first crack showing clean through the audit seal voice, that the manifest is settled. They went out into the long dark at 03, 4 of them, a young man who had buried one crew on that call, a half-grown queen with her ears forward, a burrow-blooded clerk wearing every layer the station owned, and an examiner of the compact Charter Commission carrying his own kit. And the storm took them the moment the lee of the buildings let go, took them the way the white roar takes everything. And the last thing the porch camera resolved before the ice claimed its lens was the Ranger clipping the rope line that joined them all, and the cub taking her place at the head of it, breaking trail north into the screaming dark along a route her bloodline had walked for 10,000 years. Far out on that bearing, deep in the roar, the collar trace that no storm had ever stopped was moving too. AX-1 had left the tree line the minute the relay died. He was climbing. The gorge line-up larch call was 900 vertical meters of the worst night of Ivan Skoll's life, and he spent every meter of it learning what the species files meant when they called the ashmaw a stormline animal. The cub did not walk through the blizzard. She negotiated with it. She kept them in the lee of things Skoll could not even see. Boulders, ice fins, frozen deadfall, the gorge's own bends, reading the wind through her whiskers and ruff, and where the snow had slabbed she went first, 140 kilograms testing each step for the 4 ropes behind her, and 3 times she stopped dead and stood broadside across the line, refusing passage, and each time Hale put his headlamp where her nose pointed and found rot in the snow, a hollow drum skin of wind slab over nothing, and took them around. By the second hour, Vod had stopped being carried by his pride and started being carried, in part, by a fistful of slate-gray rough she offered him at every steep pitch with a patience that was its own kind of verdict. Nobody named what was happening. The storm did not leave breath for it. At the halfway bench, the gorge bent west, and the headlamp swept across a thing Skoll knew from imagery, and Vod knew from a file, and Hale knew the way the body knows its own scars. The debris fan, a year old now, snowed over, smoothed a white field of frozen rubble below the long pale stripe the slide had peeled off the mountain, the fork that had taken the beacon shack, the radio, the 5 who had been on the line when it let go, and the 6th who had gone back up into it for them. Somewhere underneath, deeper than 2 days of digging with a folding shovel had reached, Crew 9 was still on duty. Rowan Hale did not stop. He touched 2 gloved fingers to his hood's brim as he crossed the fan's edge, a gesture so small the storm nearly owned it, and kept climbing. But the cub stopped. She stood on the white field with her great head low, nose working down through the snow at something no instrument carried a channel for, and then she put her muzzle to the sky and gave the dark a sound none of them had heard from her. Not the scream, not the verdict. A long falling, broken-edged note that the gorge walls took and stacked and handed up the mountain, and out of the roar to the north, distant, half-buried in wind, the same note came back an octave deeper. She had not known them. That was what undid Skoll hanging on the rope with the ice in his face. She had been 8 weeks old, asleep on a stranger's heartbeat, when the mountain took them all. She was not mourning her own dead. She was carrying his. Move, Hale said hoarsely, from above. 20 minutes work, people, and the headwall still loading. Mourn on the descent. The beacon stood in a saddle at the coal's lip, a steel mast and an instrument shack the size of a freight crate, and they came at it from the gorge side with lamps doused on the cub's nose, and her nose said what the dead drone in Skoll's pack had not lived to, occupied. She went iron stiff at 40 meters, ears flat, and pressed Hale bodily into the lee of an ice fin, and through Fatir in the spindrift Skoll's night lens found them. Figures at the shack, 2 on the mast line where the cut cables swung, 2 dug into the snow on the path approach with long cases, and a 5th standing apart with his back to the instrument shack, compact, patient, unmistakable, in stance to anyone who had been hit at the knees beside him on Bitterling Bluff. Sorrow Keth had come back for his own completion clause. Path approaches staked, like I said. Hale's mouth was at Skoll's ear, the words shredded small by the wind. They're set up to take whoever comes up the trail. They don't know about the gorge line, and they can't hear their own boots in this. Warden, the mast junction is the far side, out of their lamplight. 20 minutes. I splice. You watch load numbers off the spares case, and we are gone before. The mountain voted. The sound arrived through their feet before it arrived at all. A vast soft thump high in the dark above, the exact sound, Skull thought with his whole body, turning to water, of a continent clearing its throat. And then the wind brought the hiss, building. The dry river hiss of the headwall letting go its 11-day patience. Someone at the shack screamed a warning in a trade tongue. Lamps swung wild, and the slide came down onto Larch Call in the dark, twin-forked exactly as a year of survey reports said it must fork, the western tongue pouring harmlessly down the empty shack line's far couloir, and the eastern edge, the fringe of it, the last 100 meters of a thing that had traveled 2,000, unrolling across the saddle like surf across a tide pool, and it took the staked men's snow pits and the swinging mast lines and the lamplight and the world. It took Vod. He had been 4 meters back on the rope, the anchor end, the safe end, and the surf's last lobe caught the saddle's lip where he stood and folded. Him into itself almost gently, and the rope between him and Skull sang taut, and then the surge cut it against the ice fin and went still, and where the examiner of the Charter Commission had been standing there was a smooth white slope, faintly steaming, silent. What happened then happened simultaneously, and Skull, reconstructing it for the commission, would give up on sequence entirely and simply list. Rowan Hale was on the debris in 2 strides, dropping to his knees at the cut rope's vanishing point, tearing the folding shovel from his pack, the shovel, the same pattern, the one that lived packed by the door, and driving it into the slide with the flat economical fury of a man doing for the second time the thing that had cost him everything the first. The cub hit the slope beside him and went in with all 4 feet in her nose, and where the man had an entry point she had a sense the file called unverified. She dragged him bodily 2 meters left by the bandolier, planted herself, and began to dig with strokes that moved more snow than machinery, throwing a rooster tail into the wind, down, down, certain. And out of the slide smoke and the spindrift above them, where no living thing should have been standing, came the rest of the family. The collar trace had not lied and had not stopped. AX-1 walked out of the storm onto the buried saddle with the avalanche's powder still folding around his shoulders like a garment he had declined to notice, and he was not alone. Flanking him, a half-length back, burn-scared and frost-rimed and enormous, came the null registry male from the south, the king's beaten rival, the basin's other survivor, Cinder, who owed his heartbeats to a man kneeling in the snow, and who had followed the king north through the worst night of the year as though the two of them had discussed it, which, Skull would testify, perhaps in whatever language scent and season amounted to, they had. The 5 figures of Keth's crew had survived the slide's fringe by luck and snow pits. They came up out of the white shaking, half-blind, equipment gone or fouled, and found themselves standing in the open, in the heart of the long dark between 2 adult male ashmaw, with a 3rd young one bristling at a dig site she clearly considered holy ground, and a human ranger behind her whose level gray eyes, lamplit under the hood, held no negotiating margin whatsoever. Keth, professional to the spine, did the professional thing. He looked at the dart rifle half buried at his feet, at the math of bolt cycling speed against the closing speed of 1,100 kilograms, and he raised both empty hands away from his body and he said, in clean trade tongue, to the only species present he could bargain with, Ranger terms. Dig, Rowan Hale said, so they dug. That was the tableau the relay's repaired eye would have shown the basin, had it been alive yet to see. 5 contract poachers under the unblinking supervision of 2 apex predators, digging on their knees in avalanche debris for the life of a compact bureaucrat none of them had ever met, while a human and a half-grown queen worked the center of the pit, and the storm screamed on. It was the cub who found him. Her nose had been right by half a meter, the slide had rafted him sideways, and it was her jaws that took the examiner's harness and drew him up out of the mountain's grip into the lamplight, limp, blue-lipped, rhymed like a relic. He was not breathing. Hale cleared the packed snow from his airway with 2 fingers and breathed for him, counting, the cub crowding close and pouring her furnace warmth along the examiner's flank. And on the 4th breath, Vod convulsed and coughed and came back to the world of the living with a whooping, terrible gasp, and opened his eyes half a handspan from the face of the animal his order had been signed to crate, her breath washing over him in clouds, her rumble running into his chest like a generator taking load. The examiner of the Charter Commission looked up past her at the ring of beings and weather and impossible kings, and his first words back among the living were faint and dry and perfectly in character. Witness, he said, personally. The splice took Hale 18 minutes by lantern, in a wind chill the spares case thermometer declined to specify, while Skull read load numbers aloud and the family held the call. The beacon came back at 06:02, with the whole eastern fork already spent and the western readings sane, and 17 kilometers south the station's boards, Vama's boards, lit all night, the analyst having refused relief, went green in a cascade the young officer would describe unprofessionally in the official log as the best sunrise of my service. They could not descend until light, so they did the only thing the mountain permitted. They made the saddle a camp. And it was here, in the heart of the worst hours, with the wind boxing the lamps and the slide scar smoking above them, that the Basin produced the image that outlived every report, every hearing, every career in reach of it. The image Skull did not file because no field on any form would take it. The 5 who had come for a pelt and a cub sat bound in their own cargo net, in the snow, in the center of a circle. Around them, facing inward, motionless, frost-building white on slate shoulders, sat the circle itself, a king, a burned king, and a yearling queen. And the poachers did not test it all those hours, did not so much as straighten a leg, because the circle's 3 pairs of amber eyes never closed. Within the lee of the instrument shack, wrapped in every spare layer, an examiner and a warden and a ranger drank ration tea in a silence that had stopped being uncomfortable somewhere around dawn's first gray. Once, in the deepest of those hours, Sorrow Keth spoke. Skull was on the watch rotation nearest the net, and he heard the whole exchange and entered it, later verbatim, because it deserved the record. The agent had worked one arm free enough to gesture at the circle, at the frost-shouldered kings, at the yearling whose eyes had not left the net since moonset, and his voice still had its professional flatness, but something underneath the flatness had come loose on the mountain and not been recovered. Ranger, I've moved Apex stock on 11 worlds. Drugged, crated, broke, sold. I know what these animals do, and what they do is cost out. Everything alive costs out. The free hand turned over, a trader's shrug. So name it. What do they get? What does it pay them? Sitting a cordon all night in a killing wind around 5 beings they should be eating. For you, Hale didn't answer for a while. When he did, he didn't look up from the tea. Your crew dug my examiner out of that slide tonight because you were more afraid of me than of the snow, he said. She dug him out because he came up the mountain with her family. You'll never understand the difference, Keth. And that's why you lost a year of work to a clerk, a ranger, and an animal you priced by the kilogram. Nothing up here costs out. Everything up here is paid for already. He drank. Get some sleep. You've got a long time ahead of you to think about it. The agent did not sleep, as far as the watch rotation could establish. He spent what remained of the dark watching the circle watch him, doing, Skull supposed the only thing he knew how to do with what he was seeing, failing to price it. Warden, Vaude said at last. His voice was wrecked from the snow, and he held the tea in both hands like a being who had recently learned what hands were for. Your falsified drone logs, the misdirected salvage, the civilian interdiction. He watched the steam. I came up this mountain to document a corrupted preserve. I am descending it as the documentation. You understand that what I witnessed tonight cannot be made to fit the charter. With respect, Examiner, Skull said, I no longer believe that is the charter's decision. Vaude turned his head. Beyond the shack's lee, the circle sat its watch. At its center, the netted contractors steamed gently, alive to a man because a creature they had priced by the kilogram had spent the night choosing, around each of them severally, not. The examiner looked at it for a long time. Pricing, I's pricing nothing now, just looking. No, he said finally, nor mine. I begin to suspect, Warden, that it was decided 11 months ago, at 3 in the morning on a porch, and that every document since has merely been the rest of us catching up. The descent took the daylight. The storm had broken at dawn the way the basin storms broke, all at once, guiltily, leaving a sky so blue it looked like an apology and a world remade in white, and down the new world came a procession that the recovering drones. Vama had 3 airborne by mid-morning, lenses thawed, and Vama recorded everything, would make briefly famous on 4 planets. The Cub broke trail. Behind her came the humans and the examiner, roped. Behind them on a sledge improvised from the instrument shack's spare paneling, came the netted contractors, hauled, because the slope was rotten and no one else had the mast to anchor them, by the burned king of the South Country, in a harness Rovan Hale had cut down from cargo strapping, which Cinder had permitted to be buckled onto him with the weary patience of a being who had decided, somewhere out on the salt flats in the autumn, that this particular human's ideas, however undignified, tended to keep one alive. And behind them all, unburdened, unhurried, came the king of the basin, walking drag on the column the way he had once walked the boardwalk of Station 9, head low, amber eyes sweeping, the rear guard of everything. Saroketh rode his own equipment down the mountain he had climbed to strip, trussed in his own net, guarded by the species he had priced, and at the station pad, where the enforcement flights, freed by the weather, came down within the hour. The drones caught the exact frame in which his professional composure finally and permanently failed. It was not the arrest. He had been arrested before. It was the moment the transfer team wheeled him past the porch on the cargo dolly, and the yearling Ashmaw he had twice crossed a fence line to crate leaned down out of her enormous adolescent dignity and very deliberately, with the whole pad watching, sniffed him once from boots to crown and turned away. The way her kind turned from things on the trail that had stopped being interesting. Not prey, not threat, freight. The dispatch logs recorded that the prisoner said nothing further on any subject for the duration of the transfer flight. The Bureau's after-action queries hit the tower that evening in their dozens, and Skull, suspended officer, observing officer, the only officer, answered not one of them, because the basin had one more piece of business that outranked the entire civilized galaxy, and its venue was the main room of Station 9, and its instrument was the preserve's master registry, open on the station table between a pot of ration tea and a folding shovel set there to dry. The registry of the Vale Basin Preserve held a page for every living thing of record inside its fences. It was the compact's oldest instrument. Charters rose and bureaus reorganized, but the registry endured, and what stood written in it had, by treaty precedents older than half the member species, the standing of fact. On the registry's authority, animals were counted, protected, transferred, seized. The seizure order itself, Skull News cited the Cub's registry status in its first line: specimen, unregistered, disposition pending. Examiner Vaude sat before the open page with his stylus in his hand and frost burns purpling along his jaw, and he did not write anything at all for a long while. The annex, he said at last, exists because orphan stock dies without structured rearing. The transfer doctrine exists because bonded predators are dangerous, and bonds with staff distort wild behavior. The non-interference clause exists because a fed preserve is a zoo. I have enforced all three for 30 years, Warden, and I watched all three be wrong in the same night in the same animal, and I find, the stylus turned over once in the thin fingers, I find I do not know what she is. She is not wild. She walked a rope line for us. She is not tame. I have seen what sits inside her, and it is the same thing that sits inside her father, and it filled an avalanche field like a tide. She is not stock, not specimen, not asset, not pet. Every category I have is a kind of crate ranger, and she does not fit in crates. What is she? Rowan Hale looked across the table. At the great slate head resting on the bench beside him, the amber eyes half-lidded, one paw the size of a dinner plate hooked proprietarily over his boot, and gave the compact's question the only answer 11 months had left. Standing. She's family, he said. She lost hers in the storm. I lost mine on the call. Her father carried what was left of his to what was left of mine and set it down, and we did what families do. We fed each other through a famine. We stood between each other and everything that came, and we dug each other out of the snow. You don't need a new category examiner. It's the oldest one there is. You just never had to file paperwork on it before. The silence in the main room had the quality of a held instrument. Vaude looked at the page. Then the examiner of the Charter Commission, frostburned, twice dead, alive by the grace of Jaws, bent over the registry of the Vale Basin Preserve and wrote, voiding, with a single supervising line and his full seal above it, his own seizure order, and what he entered beneath the void, in the registry's eldest column, in a hand that did not shake, was a single shared page where 2 pages had been: Hale Rowan Ranger Station 9, AX3 Moth Ashmaw Female Yearling. Recorded jointly by witness of the examiner's office as one den of record, Vale Basin, Station 9, disposition, none pending, none contemplated, none to be entertained. A den of record, Vaude said, capping the seal, in the dry voice that the whole commission would shortly learn had teeth. Behind it is a protected breeding and rearing site under the Charter's foundation text, warden, older than the transfer doctrine by 2 centuries. It cannot be relocated, unmanned, or seized. It can only be guarded. He stood and pulled his ruined thermal straight, and for the first time in their acquaintance, Ivan Skull watched the audit seal face attempt, with the rust of plain disuse, something adjacent to a smile. Guard it. I will manage the catching up. The commission's review convened at midwinter's end, and it was, by every account that reached the basin, a massacre conducted entirely in procedural grammar. Examiner Vaude presented for 9 hours. He entered the year whole. The placement at the porch, time-stamped, the bottle refused, and the cup palm accepted. The heart rate graphs walking into step. The bridged fence and the 4 seconds at Bitterling. The famine ledger, every falsified line of it, laid open beside the prey-mass curves it had answered. The yard night, the flare, the voice, the cub on the steps. The salt flats, the dart, the beaten king standing his outward watch over his rival. And last, unedited, the long dark, the rope line, the dig, the circle in the snow, the netted men alive inside it. He concluded the transcript records by tabling his own original transfer memos and evidence against himself. itemizing each as an error of category, and inviting the commission to discipline him first if it intended to discipline anyone, since every violation under review had been committed in the course of being more right than his office. The commission declined to discipline anyone. The suspension dissolved. The famine clause that had nearly starved a basin went to the floor for amendment with VOD's own office sponsoring, and into the charter's commentary, where doctrine is made, went 400 words on the standing of cross-species bonds at registered dens, which jurists on World Skull would never see began citing, within the year, by the shorthand of the case that made them, the Ville Basin Standard. Hale's reinstatement file came back stamped with a permanence of tenure no junior ranger in compact service had ever held, and Skull's own review concluded with a commendation he framed, and a single line of censure for the drone logs he framed beside it, having earned, he felt both. And the deposit, the half-paid contract, the buyer in the wide dirty dark, died quietly in an enforcement file because Saroketh, facing his 12th tribunal on his first world with no bail, made the last professional calculation of his career and sold the only asset he had left. The name he traded sat at the third link of the chain, and the chain came down all the way to its anchor. The being at the anchor, it transpired, owned a private menagerie on a pleasure moon and a fondness for apex species it could never have survived 10 minutes beside, and its assets were seized under statutes VOD, located with what the enforcement liaison described as alarming relish. Some of those assets, liquidated, came back to the Ville Basin as a funded second staff post, a rebuilt south fence, and a standing enforcement flight. Station 9's new second ranger arrived at the first hint of thaw, analyst Drew Vama, who had requested ground transfer in a letter 1 sentence long. The sentence read, "I have watched this basin save itself through a lens for a year. I respectfully request the remainder of my service be conducted on the correct side of the glass." Skull endorsed it the hour it landed. He understood the condition completely. He had it himself now, and there was no returning from it. The tower was where the watching lived. But the porch was where the watching had finally, after 11 years, learned what it was for. The last weeks of winter brought the last door, and the cub, though nothing about her answered to the word anymore, walked through it the way she had walked through every other one, on her own schedule, with witnesses. It was Vama who raised the tower first, voice pitched carefully flat in the way of someone sitting on a discovery. "Warden, she's been gone 2 nights. Collar trace." Skull had finally collared her at midwinter, an event the whole basin's staff had braced for, and which had consisted, in the end, of Hale holding the band out wordlessly and Moth putting her own chin through it, because it smelled of him and of her father's, and everything that smelled of both of them was hers. Collar Trace has her stationary since before dawn. Ridge line, 2 kilometers north-northeast of Station 9. Elevation bands all wrong for hunting. Warden. The terrain model says she's inside the rock. Skull pulled the trace and the survey overlay, and sat looking at the point on the ridge until the shape of the year finished assembling itself around it. And then he flew down, and he and Rowan Hale went up through the rotten late-season snow together, following a dragline of bedding, fir boughs, mouthfuls of dry bracken hauled upslope load by load with an engineer's persistence, to a gap in the ridge rock that 11 years of survey drones had mapped and dismissed as a crack. It was not a crack. It went back and turned and opened. The chamber inside was dry, wind-shadowed, floored now in carried boughs, and big enough for a grown ash mow and a litter besides. And from its mouth, this was the thing. This was what made the ranger go quiet and stay quiet a long time. From its mouth, the whole southern basin lay open at one glance, the river braid, the kill clearing, the fence line, the pad, and dead center in it, small and clear with its lantern hook and its watch cot, and its thread of stove smoke, the porch of Station 9. The species file said yearling females denned at the far edge of the natal range, as distant from the birth story as the land allowed. Hers lay 2 kilometers from the porch, with the porch in line of sight. The den faced her family. "All winter I've been bracing to lose her north," Hale said at last. He stood in the den mouth of the first new apex line the Ville Basin had recorded in 11 years, and laughed once quietly at himself, at the species file, at the whole grieving year, and the sound had no crack in it anywhere. She wasn't leaving, she was building on. He put his hand on the cold rock of the threshold the way a man touches the doorframe of a child's first house. Close enough to hear the lantern. That's right. That's exactly right. They logged the site that evening, and VOD's office, copied as a courtesy, returned the annotation within the hour, appended in the examiner's own dry hand to the den's new registry page. Second structure, den of record, Ville Basin. The den endures, the paperwork follows, the thaw when it came gently, as if the basin had spent its violence for a generation and meant to be believed. The river ran high and quiet. The marrow elk came back north in lines 4 years thin but unbroken, finding the burned corridors greening at their edges, and with them the whole pyramid breathed in. The Rakejaw Confederation dissolved back into honest packs. The fish cats returned to their braids. And in the South Range, by an entry in the registry that had required one paragraph and reversed 2 centuries of single king doctrine, the burned stranger held formal territory of his own. Cinder of the Vile Basin, the page read null registry no longer. The 2 kings kept the peace their famine had taught them. The boundary posts along the river stayed written, twice signed, and honored to the meter, and if on some night some collar traces showed 2 old enemies fishing opposite banks of the same pool in plain sight of each other, the tower had learned what was and was not a breach, and logged it resident and let it be. And in the 3rd week of thaw, Larchcall gave up its dead. The recovery teams had waited for stable ice on standing compact orders that were themselves part of VOD's catching up. The basins fallen, the new commentary said, were to be brought home at the mountain's first consent, at whatever cost the budget line required. The teams cut down through the consolidated debris of the old fan with sounding gear and patience, and they found Crew 9 where the mountain had kept them. Together, 6 rangers still roped in their line below the ruin of the beacon shack, and they brought them down the gorge path, one by one, with the whole staff of the preserve standing unhatted in the meltwater wind at the bottom. Rowan Hale walked beside the line the entire descent. He had asked for no rope and no company, and had been given, instead, because the basin had its own opinions now about who walked alone on that call, an escort he did not refuse. She paced him on the debris-side flank the whole way down, a half-ton of slate-gray gravity, and where the path crossed the old fan she did again, unprompted, what she had done in the storm. She stopped and raised her head and gave the long-falling broken-edged note to the blue sky, once for each litter brought out of the ice, 6 times, while the recovery teams stood still as posts, and from the tree line below, twice over in 2 registers, her father and the king of the South Country sent the note back. The Den Ridge thawed the same week. The collapse that had taken AX2 had taken her deep, and no recovery team would ever have presumed. But the melt found her, the way melt finds everything, and it was Kodan's collar trace, stationary on the head wall for 2 days, that told the tower where to look and what he was standing over. The Bureau's protocols had a clean answer for deceased specimen remains, and Skoll filed the correct form and then disregarded it absolutely, because the correct form had no field for what actually happened, which was this. Rowan Hale climbed to the Den Ridge alone with a folding shovel and spent a day in the wet snow at the side of a grieving apex predator, and where the mountain had left her, they buried her, the man digging, the king moving stones no man could move. The 2 widowers of the long dark, working in silence a meter apart until the cairn over the lost queen of the Vile Basin stood taller than either of them. The rangers' cairns went up on the overlook above Station 9 on the first true day of spring. 6 of them in a line facing the high country, each with a nameplate cut by the colony shops, each raised stone by every hand and every species the year had gathered, Vama and the new. Flight crews, the recovery teams, the examiner of the Charter Commission, with his thin, precise fingers bleeding politely into his gloves and his objections to assistance intact, and then a 7th. The 7th cairn stood at the line's end, same stone, same height, facing not the high country but the Den Ridge across the valley, and its plate carried no compact designation, because Skoll had pulled the AX2 file and voided the designation himself, an act for which there was no procedure and from which there was no appeal. The plate read only what the dead crew's field notes had called her for 9 years, the name the living had inherited along with everything else. Sedge. Beneath the name, the colony engraver had cut the line Hale gave him, and the line was the year entire. The storm took 2 families. The mountain returned one. When the stones were all laid, the watchers on the overlook were given the thing the feeds would carry farthest of all the year's famous frames. Out of the firs below the overlook came the king of the basin in full daylight, before 40 assembled witnesses of 9 species, none of whom so much as shifted their feet, because the basin had taught them all by now how to stand still, and he walked the cairn line slowly, end to end, past the 6 who had died keeping the warning lights above his den, and stopped at the 7th, his mates, and stood with his great scarred head bowed over it for the length of 11 breaths. Then he turned to the man beside it, and before the examiner, the warden, the analysts, the flights, the drones, and the open sky, 1,100 kilograms of apex predator lowered his head that final handspan and rested his brow, gently, against the chest of Rowan Hale, over the heartbeat, and the young man who had carried 6 names through a year of winters put his hand up to the storm-gray jaw and held on, and the overlook heard him say, quiet and steady, the only eulogy the 7th cairn ever needed. We kept them, you and me, all of them. We kept them all the way home. Skull wrote the last entry of the cycle on the porch of Station 9, on the first warm evening of the new year, with the registry open before him and the lantern hissing its old song and the basin going violet below. He had flown down with no errand. That was itself the entry, in a way. The tower ran clean, Vama had the boards, the alert column had sat green for 30 days, and the warden of the Veal Basin had begun in his 12th year to keep some watches in person on the correct side of the glass. At the rail, Rowan Hale was mending a harness buckle by lantern light. On the boards between them, taking up the spectacular majority of the porch, lay the reason the compact's jurists on 4 worlds were busy rewriting the definition of wild, her chin on the ranger's boot, her amber eyes making their slow sweeps of the dark she owned. She went up to her own den most nights now by her own road on her own hours. And most evenings, first she came down to the porch, to the lantern, to the heartbeat, because the den faced the family, and the family kept the light on. Skull dated the page. Above the date, the year's final lines, and he wrote them as plainly as the year had taught him to write, for the file he had once addressed to no one and now addressed, openly, to whoever kept this watch after him. A year ago tonight, the apex of this basin carried the last thing he loved out of the wreck of his world and laid it on the chest of the last man at Station 9, and every alarm I command called it a breach. For the record, and for whoever reads this when I am done, it was not a breach. It was a den being founded, grief walking to grief, because grief knows its own scent. And it has since survived poachers, famine, a rival king, an avalanche, a seizure order, and me. The charter asks what the animal is to the man, and the man to the animal, and offers me categories. I decline them all. Write what the registry writes. 1 den. Watch kept both directions in all weathers. He closed the registry. Below the overlook, the firs moved in the warm dark, and on the ridge to the north-northeast, framed in her den mouth against the first stars, a young queen watched the lantern burn, and at the tree line where he had stood the whole year round, the old king watched the porch, and the porch watched him back, and nothing in the Veal Basin was alone, and nothing in it was afraid. In the morning there would be tracks in the dooryard again, vast and familiar, passing within a handspan of the watch-cot and onward to the weir pools, the rounds of a resident logged and lawful going by his own front door. Warden Ivan Skull slept that night at Station 9 with the window cracked to the spring air, and for the first time in 40,000 generations of burrow-blooded ancestry, the sound of an apex predator moving in the dark outside carried him not toward the old terror, but down easily into sleep, the sound of the largest thing on the mountain, keeping the watch over its own.